have some slides that I'm going to show. Talking. Just get it going here. Are we all good? Can everyone see that? Okay. Thank you so much, Laura, for the introduction, and Debbie and the rest of the museum staff for inviting me to collaborate on this really wonderful and exciting exhibit on the archaeology, or at least the Native American archaeology of Cape Cod. It's really been something that I don't get to do very often in my career. I'm a cultural resource management archaeologist, which essentially means that I go out on projects where there is a requirement to have some sort of archaeological study done prior to development or some type of ground disturbing activity. And so a lot of the projects I work on are not sites or locations that I've selected because they're particularly significant. So being able to work with the museum on this project has really been extremely exciting for me. So thank you for the invitation to talk with you tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the general archaeology of Cape Cod as it relates to Native Americans, and sort of give you a little context without having too much overlap with the exhibit. Hopefully, as everyone has mentioned earlier, if you haven't seen the exhibit, please go go see it. This might give you a little context and background to kind of expand upon what you're going to see in the exhibit. I want to acknowledge right from the outset that all of Cape Cod and most of southeastern Massachusetts is part of the Wampanoag indigenous homelands, both the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead-Aquina. Those are the two federally recognized Indian tribes in Massachusetts, but there are many other currently non-federally recognized tribes and groups who are often related by kin connections and are all connected to Wampanoag homeland. So this entire area that the exhibit focuses on and that I'll be talking about today is and continues to be Wampanoag homelands. I'm speaking to you today from my office in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, so I'm in Narragansett homelands. Neighbors to the Wampanoag, people pass back and forth over time. There's a lot of great documentation about interactions among Wampanoag and Narragansett people throughout the different periods of time. So I wanted to make that acknowledgement. So the exhibit that's up in the museum now draws from archaeological sites that have been identified across the Cape. And we set up the exhibit to try and highlight all of the different periods, general periods of Native American land use and activity on the Cape, stretching back 12 to 10,000 years ago and coming right up to the period when there was the initial contact with Europeans. Obviously, Native people continued to be on the Cape and created archaeological deposits after that time, but the exhibit is focused specifically on that, what we refer to as the pre-contact period, so prior to the 1600s. The information that we get about archaeological sites comes from a lot of different sources, and I'm going to talk about some of those tonight. But the location for this information is at the Massachusetts Historical Commission in Boston. The Office of the State Archaeologist maintains a database of every recorded archaeological site within the Commonwealth. So that includes sites that were identified by homeowners and avocational archaeologists, through academic studies, field schools, and CRM projects, cultural resource management projects, which are the type of surveys that I work on. That information is confidential. The state is very careful to make sure that specific information about archaeological sites is maintained as confidential information, just to ensure the security and safety of those sites, and so that people who would go out and loot or collect artifacts without authorization don't have access to that information. And it's also to protect sites that have sacred and ceremonial significance to Wampanoag people. So this map that you're looking at is just to kind of give you a sense of sort of the breadth and scope of archaeological sites. These little boxes that you see, some of them are small, some of them are large. Those are all the recorded archaeological sites on the Cape. And at this point, there are over 900 recorded Native American archaeological sites from the tip of Provincetown all the way to the Bourne Bridge. They represent, as I mentioned, this very, very long span of time, people moving in and around the landscape over very long periods of time. And this is by no means an exhaustive inventory. Sites are being located all the time. despite the degree of development, even in some of the most heavily developed, coastal areas, we found archaeological sites, in the little sliver of grass between two houses that were built in the 1900s. So there's a lot still to learn and a lot of information that we don't know. But I'm going to tell you what we do know. This is just to give you a sense. This is one of the things that's in the exhibit. This is a slide showing how the landmass changed over the period of time when Native Americans were using the landscape. And if you look at the slide in the upper left-hand corner, 10,000 years ago, when people were first coming into the Cape Cod region, this area that you see in green, that was the landform. So there was no Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Elizabeth Islands. It was all one landmass. And the shoreline, as you can see, southeast of Nantucket, it was 10 to 20 miles further out than the shoreline we see today. So the landscape that people were moving around and living on 10,000 years ago was vastly different from what we see today. So as archaeologists, when we're looking for these really early archaeological sites, we have to use kind of a different perspective to think about where we might find sites. So someplace that's at the coast today, maybe that was just an elevated area 10,000 years ago, or the mouth of an estuary today may have been a small glacial stream that was just forming. As we move through time, between about 8,000 and 4,000 years ago, you can see that glacial melting, as the glaciers receded to the north, we were pulling back from the landscape of the Cape. These tremendous volumes of water were being released, and gradually the shoreline was kind of made smaller and smaller as sea levels rose, until you get to about, excuse me, about 4,000 years ago, when the Cape more or less resembled the outline you see. There was a little bit of change. You can see kind of on the inner Cape, Cape Cod Bay was a little bit smaller and shallower. And the area around Chatham and between Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard was a little bit larger than it is today. But basically by about 4,000 years ago, the sort of environment and the landform that would be recognizable today had been formed. And then the current coastline that we see formed about 2,000 years ago. So keep that in mind as I'm talking about the different periods of Native American history as we go through and kind of picture that the land was looking very different during those times. So the information that we get as archaeologists and that you'll see in the exhibit comes from a couple of different sources of archaeological work. One of the main sources of information for us are avocational or amateur archaeological studies and findings. The Massachusetts Archaeological Society is an organization that's been around since the 1930s. And it is a collaboration of professional and amateur archaeologists who come together for regular meetings. Back in the 1930s, a lot of the people who were involved in the MAS were actually collectors who lived on the Cape and would gather together in groups to go on digs to look for artifacts. Ross Moffat and Howard Torrey were two Cape residents who were very prolific collectors who did a lot of research, especially in the Wellfleet, Truro, East Dam areas. And these two images that you see down at the bottom here are some of the collections of these two men, some really incredible artifacts. They also wrote site reports and published them in the Mass Archaeological Society Bulletin. So we have a record, even though at this point, archaeology sort of as a science or as a discipline hadn't developed. They actually took pretty good notes, not the way an archaeologist would do it today, but they included sketch maps of the sites that they were finding and descriptions of the soils in which they were finding the artifacts. Unfortunately, a lot of the very specific information about where artifacts were found in the ground and any of the sort of associated soil stains that were around them, as well as unfinished tools or little bits of chipped stone that were used to make tools. Typically, those things weren't collected or recorded. So the information that we get from these early avocationalists is really useful and really helpful, and it provides us with a lot of information, but it's somewhat incomplete. One of the things that a lot of collectors on the Cape were attracted to were exposed shell middens, dense piles of shell. There's an image here on the slide that shows you kind of, this is a shell pit that's sitting right below a darker plow zone soil on the edge of an exposed bluff. These were areas that collectors knew would contain really dense food remains from shellfish feasts and refuse pits that were created by Native Americans during long periods of time. So these shell middens were created over a period probably from about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, right up into the historic period. And seeing these visible on the shoreline, really, that was a place where avocationalists knew they could go to look for sites. So a lot of the early sites that were recorded on the Cape were sort of skewed to be only along the shoreline in these places where sites were visible eroding. Down in the bottom right, this is an image from another Mass Archaeological Society report. This is known as the Cape Cod Canal Pot. And it has been, I don't know if it still is, but it has been on display at Plymouth Plantation. It is, has been put back together. It was in fragments, but it was a complete, very, very large clay pottery vessel, very unique shape with decorations on the rim that was identified by another avocationalist, Jesse Brewer, when the Cape Cod Canal was being cut through, actually, or widened, not the initial construction of the Cape Cod Canal. But this was a really significant find. It's a very unusual artifact, a very rare artifact. So the contributions of avocationalists to what we know about the archaeology of Cape Cod really shouldn't be diminished. The upper right here, I have just an image showing you another Mass Archaeological Society report. This is from the Matacason Purchase site in Chatham. This is one of the sites that's highlighted in the exhibit as well. And this was excavated by members of the Mass Archaeological Society in the 1970s, so relatively recent by standards of what the other individuals I was talking about. And as you can see, this site actually was much more carefully excavated. A grid was placed over the site. The site was excavated in controlled squares with notes being taken for both the horizontal and the vertical control of where artifacts were being found. So this kind of shows you the range of activity that avocational archaeologists can be involved in. And the Matacason Purchase site actually was selected by the MAS members because it was a known sort of woodland period village site. And after they did their excavation, they didn't excavate the entire site. It was proposed for a subdivision. And so our company, PAL, was actually called in to do some additional study at the site. And one of the really neat things we were able to do was to take, we worked on the site in the 1990s, and we were able to take the records and the information from the 1970 excavation and kind of work off of that, add to the information that came out of the report. So that was definitely a really great collaborative effort. So in addition to avocational studies, on the Cape, you also have academic and institutional archaeology that's been done, and then other types of professional archaeological study. So one of the biggest sources of information on the professional side comes from archaeological work done within the Cape Cod National Seashore. So during the 1980s, well, late 1970s and up to the 1990s, the National Park Service funded a number of archaeological survey efforts across the entirety of the Cape Cod National Seashore to actually go out and locate all of the archaeological sites that might be located within their land. So that included both ancient Native American and historic period sites. And they spent a number of years doing it. It was actually a very pioneering study at the time, and a model that other parks across the country actually used. The archaeologist who was in charge at the seashore actually later became the chief archaeologist for the National Park Service. So he really rose to prominence, I think, in large part due to the work that he did, the really exemplary work that he did at the National Seashore. Subsequently to finding sites, there were targeted larger scale excavations at some of the more significant sites on the seashore. And one of those was the Carnes site, which is another site that's highlighted in the exhibit. And this image here at the bottom left of the screen are the excavations that went on at the Carnes site in the 1990s. This was what might be considered salvage excavation or emergency excavation. The site was actually exposed during a series of extreme storms, coastal storms, that pulled away a large chunk of the bluff within the seashore in Eastham. And it was sort of a race against time between the tides, the slumping sandy soils, and the threat of another storm coming in between the excavations. A team of professional Park Service archaeologists and volunteers went out and collected as much information as they could about the site. And you can see a lot more about that site in the exhibit. The other, we've also had some field schools, academic field schools done through the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. Some of you may know Fred Dunford, who was an archaeologist at the museum for a very long time. He ran a couple of field schools on the grounds of the museum and in some other places on the Cape, where he brought in students and professionals to do survey and excavation. And the University of Massachusetts at Boston did a field school at the Sandy's Point site, which is, I'm sorry, I don't have a good picture of it, but these string outlines show a series of corn hills that date to the late 1500s, early 1600s, Native American planting field. That this project was actually one that was identified by PAL, a project that I worked on, again, as part of a survey for a housing subdivision. And because of the significance of the site and its rarity, the university was able to take over as a field school and do a lot more extensive study and research than we would have been able to do as a private contracted company to the homeowners. The homeowners ended up not developing this lot. They put it into a preservation restriction, and the university was able to come back there over a series of several years to really collect a tremendous amount of information about what is a very rare site on the Cape. So the professional archaeology differs a little bit from the academic archaeology in that any work that's done in Massachusetts needs to be done under an archaeological permit, which gets issued by the state archaeologist. So going back to the Mass Historical Commission, the people who maintain the files. So we have to prepare a technical proposal. We have to present a thorough and detailed methodology, state and federal standards for doing archaeological work. We have to maintain accurate field records that are permanently maintained in archival conditions. All of the artifacts and cultural materials that are collected have to be cleaned, cataloged, and housed in archivally stable materials and in a location that's safe. And they also have to be available if other researchers would like to come in and use them for any type of study. And all of the archaeological surveys and projects that are done in Massachusetts also have to be followed up by a technical report. So that includes all the results of the work, the findings, background research that was done, consultation with Native Americans if that's appropriate for the type of site. And the Mass Historical Commission maintains those reports in perpetuity. As I mentioned too, the cultural resource management studies, the type of work that I do, is primarily driven by development and state, federal, or local requirements to have some type of due diligence done before construction or ground disturbance goes on. So unlike the avocationalists who selected the sites, selected the locations where they wanted to look for artifacts, look for sites, we're given, an outline, a polygon of a place, and then it's up to us to figure out where within that area are the most likely locations for archaeological sites. And many times we don't find any. A lot of what we do is digging holes in the ground that have nothing in them. But we use all of the information about every site that's been identified before we've come into a project area to help inform us about the best places to be looking for sites and what we might expect to find. So more often than not, we do identify sites. So I briefly just want to go through the different times, the generalized time periods for Native American activity. Again, each one of these is represented in one or more of the exhibits that are in the museum. And some of the sites that we selected were occupied over numerous generations or over many millennia. So they may have elements of more than one period. As I mentioned, the earliest occupation on the Cape happened between about 12 and 10,000 years ago. So far, There have not been any completely documented identified sites dating to this very earliest period on Cape Cod. They have been identified in other parts of southeastern Massachusetts, including coastal Massachusetts, but there are artifacts that are in local collections that date to this period. So we know those sites are there or they were there. And if you think back to that map, and this is just a sort of very crude version of that earlier map that I showed you, that's much more accurate. If you think about it, there's a fairly strong likelihood that some of the earliest sites that were occupied, that were created, are submerged right now. And we don't really have the technology, unfortunately, to be able to excavate those sites. So if you picture what you've seen on National Geographic or on other programs where you have divers going down and going, looking at shipwreck sites, for example, most of those are in relatively shallow waters, and they're also in sitting close to the surface of the ocean floor. The sites that would likely be identified that date back to this period, that are ancient Native American sites, are in some places probably several miles below the current surface, and are likely buried even on the surface of the ocean floor. They're probably buried under sediments that have washed in and been deposited over the past 10,000 years. So there is hope. All of these wind farm projects that are coming, that have come already and will be coming, have had archaeological cultural resource studies done in advance of doing construction. And geoarchaeologists, so archaeologists who focus on the soil, the connection between soil and human land use, have identified out on the continental shelf buried, they call them paleosols, so buried land surfaces. They can tell from looking at the sediments that they pull up from these very deep soil cores that the conditions are right for there having been dry land at those depths. They know what the depth is out on the continental shelf. So far, they haven't been able to expand the soil coring to do actual excavation, but one of the hopes is that as we improve technology, as remotely operated vehicles become more capable for doing some types of work, that may be something that we'll be able to identify in the future. So whether or not you're for or against the wind farms, know that they're paying for some cutting edge archaeological work out on the continental shelf. In general, though, we identified these sites primarily by different types of tools. At this stage, people were primarily using large spears. They weren't using a bow and arrow 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. And we find fishing tools. These are plummets, fishing weights. So we know that people were utilizing the shoreline during these periods. And again, while we haven't found those early sites on Cape Cod, we know that they're there somewhere. The next sort of major breakdown or division for sort of stylistically and what we see in the archaeological record happened from about 7,000 to 3,000 years ago. So this was that period when the environment was relatively rapidly, by relatively rapidly, I mean over a period of 2,000 to 3,000 years, kind of stabilizing to what we see today. And there was a diversity of tools and other types of artifacts during this period. So you see still the use of spear points, but around 4,000 years ago, the chip stone projectiles start to become smaller, and it's likely that people were using bow and arrow at that stage. Steatite or soapstone vessels. This is an example of a complete carved soapstone vessel that was used by indigenous people. The soapstone sources, probably the closest ones for the Cape, were in Rhode Island. So the soapstone vessels that have been found on the Cape were almost certainly transported. The material was transported from a soapstone quarry somewhere else. There was a lot of woodworking going on. While we don't find the wood objects, we find tools that are indicative of woodworking, so gouges and drills that were made out of stone. And during the Archaic period, we have a lot of recorded sites, so we know that people were utilizing every environment basically that was out there. So shoreline, interior, swamps, dry uplands, kettle hole ponds, streams. Really, sites are found in every possible environmental niche on the Cape. So we know people were actively living and moving across the entire landscape. Archaeologists characterize the woodland period, which is the period that occurred right before European contact, basically because it's defined by the development and use of clay pottery. Clay pottery vessels characterize woodland sites. And so this is an example of a piece of cord marked pottery. This is a really nice large piece where the impressions are really clear and visible. And these little white flecks that you see, those are bits of shell. So shell was used to temper the pottery. It wasn't highly fired. It was air dried and then sort of slow fired over an open fire. But there are a lot of different designs, pottery designs, that we can find that help us more specifically date when they came from. Also during this period, maize cultivation and horticulture started. So this is an example here of a carbonized maize kernel that really only survived because it's burned. It's a very unusual thing to be able to find. And it helps to document that sort of transition from hunting and gathering into moving into a horticultural lifestyle, incorporating different types of foods, animals, plants into the diet, and sort of utilizing different environments as well. And sites that date to the woodland period represent the largest number of the recorded sites on the Cape. It may be because a lot of woodland sites are characterized by these shell piles, these shell midden deposits, and because they're so highly visible, they were definitely the focus of the early avocationalists. So I think that the numbers skewed a little bit. We have more of these sites mainly just because they're more visible and they're easier to see on the ground surface. Then finally, the last sort of period that's covered in the exhibit is what we refer to as the contact period. So between about 1500 or so to about 1650. So it covers the period when there was just occasional interaction between explorers and actually European fishermen who were coming over and looking for new sources of cod. Would have, there are some records in Europe that go back to the early 1500s that talk about Europeans having these very minimal and very short-term interactions with the indigenous people in the Cape Cod area and all the way up to Maine. A lot of the sites that date to this period are identified because they contain a mix of traditionally indigenous Native American tools and some European tools or trade goods. So things like beads, pottery, metal are often found in combination with chipstone tools and clay pottery. So that's one way that we identify those sites. There's also evidence on the Cape at a number of places of structures that look similar to this Wetu. This is actually based on not only indigenous knowledge, but also, archaeological information that has been able to find sort of the outline of these structures. Oftentimes, this is an example of one that was identified actually on Martha's Vineyard that includes sort of an interior where there might have been a hearth or a fire pit and an exterior area, that would have been bounded by small posts that would have held it in place. And certainly on the Cape, everybody knows about First Encounter Beach in Eastham. We have, the Pilgrim's First Landing in Provincetown, and William Bradford's journal that talks about, finding and essentially desecrating some indigenous burial sites and raiding corn from indigenous sites that the first Europeans, the first settlers encountered. So just to sum up, I think that the exhibit left behind is great, but one of the reasons that left behind is a good term to use is because archaeology is really an incomplete picture of what happened in the past. Our soils are extremely acidic in New England, and things like bone, wood, baskets, textiles, anything organic, if it's not burned, if it's not heavily carbonized, it very rarely survives in the soil. We don't even have wood and bone that survives 500 years. So forget about 10,000 years. I mean, what we see, what's left in the ground for an archaeologist to find are these hard materials, stone, especially chipped stone, stone used to create fire pits, stone made up into piles. And we have food remains certainly, but a lot of what we find are things like this. This is an example of some type of a pit that was dug. And you can see that the soil is a different color, but this pit in particular was mostly empty. I mean, what we found in it were maybe a handful of pieces of chip stone for making tools, but this pit probably held, a lot of either food. It may have been used as a temporary food storage pit. It could have been used for basically anything. So we make a lot of assumptions as archaeologists, and even in the 25, 30 years now that I've been doing archaeology in the region, a lot of what we think and a lot of how we interpreted sites has changed. Many artifacts and sites have multiple meanings, and certainly that's something that, as we have become more aware of the need to collaborate closely with present day indigenous people, the descendants of the people who created these sites, it's really sort of changed the way that an archaeologist interprets a site. I'm not an indigenous person. I come from a very different background. What I've learned about archaeology is very different from the perspective and the historical background of a Wampanoag person. And so by working together, by looking at archaeological sites sort of together, we, I think, are coming up with a much better sense of how the landscape was used and how it was important to and continues to be important to indigenous people. And that's sort of my last slide that I want to leave with you, is that the archaeology that's done today, every single project that I work on is done in collaboration and consultation with the indigenous people or the descendant communities. If I'm working on a historic site and it's not a Native American site, then, if we're working, for example, at a poor farm or doing a cemetery delineation project, we are always talking with and getting the perspective of the descendant community for wherever we're doing our work. And so certainly for Native American sites, having collaboration with elders and tribal leaders and tribal youth when we're out on sites and we're actually doing our excavation and having these conversations about how sites should be interpreted is tremendously important. And I just want everybody to kind of go away from the exhibit when you're seeing it, thinking about the fact that, there are plenty of people around today who can tell you a very different and a much fuller story about the history of the Wampanoag use of the landscape. And with that, I'm going to leave you with the photo taken a couple of weeks ago on the ferry. And I'd like to thank you for your time and for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today. And especially thanks to Debbie, Tom, Colleen, Chris, and Nancy for working so closely with me and being so supportive as this exhibit kind of came together, and especially during this last year when we couldn't meet in person. I really thank you for all your help and support. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has them. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Holly. So much to think about there. So much great information. We do have a question that came in during the talk. I think this was spurred on by talking about how big the land mass was and so forth. And so the question is, what about the cores that WHOI has been taking from beneath the ocean? Do they ever contain artifacts or parts of artifacts?
That's a good question. I am not familiar with where they're doing their coring or where they've collected them, but I know that they do regularly. If they don't have archaeologists on staff, they definitely have geoarchaeologists and geomorphologists who are looking at those cores. And I'm sure that they're collaborating with the same folks who are doing many of the surveys out for the wind farm sites, because it's really related and integrated information. So as far as I know, I don't believe that I have read or heard about anybody finding artifacts in soil cores. I think it's sort of a needle in the haystack kind of a thing. My understanding is that the cores are not very large. I mean, they go very deep, but that, horizontally, they're not very large. And so it would really be lucky if you happen to, land on an artifact. But that being said, it's entirely possible. And the fact that verifiably using radiocarbon dating, they have identified what are capped, formerly dry landscapes or land formations below the ocean floor means that there are likely archaeological sites out there to be identified.
And a follow-up question is also cores in the cranberry bogs. That turned up any?
Yes. What I'm familiar with for cranberry bogs and kettle ponds in general, I'm drawing a blank on his name now, but Harvard Forest. There's a scientist from the Harvard Forest who did a lot of soil coring in kettle ponds and bogs across the Cape and the islands to identify climate change factors, environmental change over time. I don't know that he identified any archaeological materials, but what he did do was he was able to kind of reconstruct very specific changes to the environment, whether it was hot or dry, how rainy it was at various periods, thousands of years back in time. And I will say that we've done a number of projects in areas that are former cranberry bogs. And for anyone who's familiar, they're always in incredibly clean, sandy soils. And those are the exact spots where indigenous people were living for long periods of time. And so every project we've ever done that is in or near a cranberry bog has identified a pretty large ancient archaeological site.
Thank you. Any other questions for Holly? You can put them in the chat. Now's your opportunity. Other questions? Griffin, we can probably stop the screen share now. And so we can see everyone and see if anyone has a question or a hand up. Looking through to see if I see.
This is Karen. I have a question.
Oh, great. Karen, go ahead.
There was a Wampanoag origin, well, kind of an origin story that talked about Moshup, the giant, who pushed his feet out through the sand to create the islands of the Vineyard and Nantucket, but that doesn't seem to fit exactly with the historical geology that you presented.
Well, I think that it could. I think that for the most part, the indigenous histories that I'm aware of, and I'm familiar with the Moshup creation story, I think it just depends on what time period you want to set that to. I mean, certainly, if you talk about the way that the landform changed, there was a period at which time the islands were formed and the Cape was formed, and I think that it's not too far off to consider that those things could be parallel. That perhaps Moshup created, that story happened at about the time 3,000 to 4,000 years ago when the islands were created. I mean, I like to try and include as much historical perspective as I can in the reports that I put together and in the information I get as an archaeologist. And I really don't think there needs to be this either or kind of mentality. I think it's perfectly acceptable to consider that, the archaeologists and the scientists don't know everything, and that, a scientific explanation can also have a parallel cultural explanation, and those two things can go hand in hand.
Very good. Good answer. Other questions? And you can either put it in the chat or just take yourself off mute and ask the question if you like. Other questions? I had one, which I was interested that Ross Moffat was an early collector, where he's very well known as an early artist in the Provincetown art colony.
Yeah, it's funny because I have known about him as an avocational archaeologist for many, many years, and I only recently found out that he was a very well-known artist in Provincetown. So yeah, I think he just had an interest in in both things, apparently.
So Holly, I just want to let you know that we had a special visitor at the museum today, Fred Dunford.
Oh, wonderful.
He wanted to pass on his greetings to you, and
oh, great.
I'll be sending you his email. He's now at Plymouth Plantation, and I had the opportunity to visit the plantation a week ago, to take my granddaughter up there. And the Weetus that we have are kind of interesting, but the one at the Plymouth Plantation has 3 pits in it. It's an enormous Weetu, so it's a more of a year-round Weetu. Okay. And it's really interesting. And it was built by the Wampanoag tribe. So it's thanks again for your presentation. We really appreciate your.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions for Holly while we have her? Now's your opportunity. Questions for Holly? I'm looking around, seeing if any hands are raised here. I know sometimes people think of their question right after we end, so.
And anyone's free to email me too if they have a follow-up.
I was wondering about the like when the canal was dug and when it is dredged periodically, if anybody is out there looking for stuff while that's happening.
Yeah, good question. Well, that pot that I mentioned earlier on, that was
Yeah.
actually, it was sort of the way that the story goes, the way it was written up is that it was literally hanging, kind of hanging out of a cut when the canal was widened by the
Yeah.
Army Corps. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains the bridges and the canal, and as a federal agency, they are required to have archaeological studies done before they do any type of work. So we've actually done several surveys for the Corps on their lands on either side of the canal. We've identified, some sites because as you, I'm sure know, that was a natural, it was the confluence of the Scusset and Manamet River. So it was a very active and very highly utilized corridor for Native people going, back and forth between the bay and the sound and getting around. As far as dredging goes, I don't know if when they do their dredging, I believe there is an Office of Underwater Archaeology in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Research, and they review and permit, near shore and subsurface work that's being done. And there are situations where they do require an archaeologist basically to essentially go through the spoils that come up from dredging, and they kind of know where there should be or where there's the possibility of archaeological deposits and where it's mostly already been just filled in or there's sand there. So I'm not sure about that. I do know that one of the earliest Paleo-Indian, one of those early projectile points that was found by a dredger fisherman who was dredging, I think someplace out of either Dartmouth or New Bedford, and it came up in their hall, and they found this stone tool. I think it's in one of the collections at the Dartmouth Historical Society, actually. But and the fisherman, said that he had picked it up several miles offshore, and this was one of the earliest sort of documented finds that sort of made clear that these artifacts could be found, out there. So there you go.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Any other questions for Holly, looking around? Well, Holly, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And
Thanks for the opportunity.
we're so lucky to have your involvement in this very special exhibit that I know will be illuminating for so many people in the region. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight to our annual meeting. And we hope to see you soon at the museum. And everyone, have a great night. Thank
Terrific.
you.
Thank you very much. Way to go.